Dr. Davis's first ministry was with the RCIA, where she not only welcomed others into the church, but also revitalized her own spirituality. After working for the Archdiocese of Chicago as coordinator of Reclaiming Christ in Life Young Adult Ministry, Timone co-founded Peace-Centered Wholeness with her husband Orlando, where they are blending clinical counseling and spiritual companion. In addition to running this business, Timone is an assistant professor in the Institute of Pastoral Studies at Loyola Institute for Ministry, at the Institute for Pastoral Studies at Loyola University in Chicago. In her spare time, she serves as the treasurer of the National Institute for Ministry with Young Adults and associate convener of the Black Catholic Theological Symposium. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Timone Davis.
Thank you very, very much. How's everybody this morning? You all don't sound excited. I'm thinking that you should be excited because you're not teaching right about now, right? But then you're here, and so it's like, it's not quite like a day off, right? So I got a whole hour. Let me just tell you, I don't typically talk for a whole hour. That's not how I do it. I talk for a very brief amount of time, and then it's my pleasure to invite you into the conversation that I would hope that we would end up having a dialogue, so then it's no need for a question and answer because we're doing it already. Is that fine with you? All right, that's great. So let me talk a little bit about my story, your story. First off, I want to let you know that my story, your story is a hyphenated word. I think it appears it's got a comma in there, and it's hyphenated. And why is it hyphenated for me? Why do I think that makes a difference? My story, your story talks about the connection that we have between us. And as a hyphenated word, it begins to visually invoke the connection. And it begins with this concept that anything that we want to talk about, when I start talking about my story, whatever is going on in my life, you, the listener, begin to make a connection to your story. And so it is in our connection that we find that we are people who believe in a God that have similar experiences. My story does not exist without your story. But in order to get your story, I have to make room for it. Right? So we have to make room for each other's story to be heard, to be listened to be interacted with. Now, that's the very short version of what I've written in a book, right? To be able to tell people what is my story, your story. That's this very short version. And it's something that I came across when I was, would you believe I was teaching high school at one point? I was thinking about that when I was on the flight from Chicago. I was like, when was the last time I was in a high school teaching? And I was like, man, that was 2004. That's a long time. I'm about to say that was 20 years ago. I'm about to be able to say that was 20 years ago that I was doing that. It was in those classes, teaching young people, that I was like, when I was in high school taking theology, I hated it, right? Like, out of all the classes that we have to take at a Catholic high school, they make us take theology every year. And I didn't like it, right? I felt like I was the person at a school who, I was Catholic because my mom said we were going to be Catholic. And I was at a Catholic high school because my mom said that her children were going to a Catholic high school. There was nothing about the experience that I liked. Which said that once I was going to be a teacher in said environment, I needed to actually explain how I got there, right? Like, do I want to be teaching a class where everybody hates it? Hell no. But I took the job, right? And I was thinking, what's wrong with me? That I take a job where nobody wants to take the class. I'm only in this class because they said this is what I have to do. And I was teaching freshmen. You see, somebody was just like, oh. And so I started thinking about what matters to young people the most to get their interest. And it's really to get to know who I am as the instructor. And so on the first day of class, I do what's called extended introductions. I do it in the graduate program that I teach as well. Very first day of class, that's all we do is introductions. We don't do anything else. Now, a lot of people leave that, especially at the graduate level, going, did we just have class? Is this what I'm paying for? But they don't appreciate it until like 5-6 weeks in, right? That they've had this period of extended introductions. But at the high school level, I was doing it where each kid had to, tell me a little bit about themselves. And I tended to try to base it around what was happening in the world. So if something great had just happened in the baseball world, then I would say introduce yourself through the lens of whatever just happened in baseball, right? And they would be like, okay, kids would be like, well, I don't even like baseball. Right, and so how are you introducing yourself through the lens of the fact that you don't even like baseball? But it was always something different, right? And at the end of their introductions, they got to ask me anything. You get to ask me anything about me. Whatever it is you want to know. And they were like, are you going to tell us? I said, depends on the question. I have the right of refusal to answer the question, but you get to ask the No holds barred. You get to ask whatever you want. Well, kids are intrigued by that. They get to ask you, are you married? You got kids? Do you like God? Do you like this school? They get to ask you all sorts of stuff, right? And it was one thing that I thought was very important, to always be honest. If I opened up the door for you to ask me anything, then it was my responsibility to be honest. Do you like so-and-so? Not really. But I don't have to like them to work with them. You don't have to like them to be taught by them. It's your job to learn. It's not your job to have to like everybody. And so we began to unpack what does it mean to bump up against people that we don't like? And what is it that we don't like about them? Right? And so it begins to unpack so many things. At the end of that day, whatever, you're done asking questions about me. I'm not answering any more questions about me. But what happens over the course of the year? I'm always talking about me. The assignments that I give are rooted in me, right? When we're talking about scripture, I tell them how I didn't like scripture when I had to study it. It was boring and dull, and they're always talking about old dead people. Right? And it was never anybody in my life who was around to unpack it for what it meant today. Well, now kids are interested in the fact that you didn't like scripture either. No, I didn't like it. But you're going to like it by the time I'm done. This is going to be something new for you. And so I made more work for myself than I did for them. I would create assignments that were like, hey, let's do a newspaper that features the scripture stories that we just covered. I need a headline. I need a comic section. I need sports, right? I need all of these sections. You're going to work in groups. You got 2 weeks to do this. But I need you to bring it up to current day. So we're going to talk about the 10 Commandments as the headline, but it's got to be modern? Correct. Those type of assignments got kids really involved in the scriptures, right? First of all, you got to read the scripture. You got to read it again. You got to think about what we covered in class, and now you got to turn it into some modern day story that somebody is going to read. Well, they loved it. It's one hell of a thing to try to grade, though. Because kids start producing such great stuff. How do you say that someone failed? Right? How do you fail at something like that? And so one of the things that I realized, when I first started, I was at an all-girls school. I ended up at an all-boys school. But at an all-girls school, they were all about rubrics. Well, when I started teaching high school, I didn't know a thing about teaching high school. I didn't know a thing about teaching, and I for sure didn't know anything about a rubric. But everything that you did, you had to create a rubric in order to grade. I was just like, this principal is insane. I have come to appreciate the value of a rubric, though, in grading some of the crazy kind of projects that I had students doing, right? In essence, nobody is failing with projects like this, right? Nobody is failing. But what does that mean about how I was trying to get my story into theirs? It cracked open the door for them to be who they are. I had students who were confirmed atheists. I don't believe in God. I'm just in this class. My mama sent me to this school, blah, 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 blah. I said, yeah, I know the feeling. I'm not doing the work. I said, sure you are. From your standpoint. You don't believe in God? That's cool. The essay that you're writing about God, you got to tell me about why you don't believe. I still got to do the assignment? For sure you do. For the kids that were in the class who were Buddhist and Muslim, you're writing from your standpoint. One of the things that I thought it was important that when I began to unpack my story only comes from one perspective, and that's as a black woman in the United States. I'm not presenting any other story. I'm not trying to present any other story. Well, in doing so, what that did for the kids is open the door for them to be who they are. The one who was an atheist, the one who was Muslim, the one who was Buddhist, right? The one who was unsure. For the Protestant voices that were in the room, it opened the door for them to be who they are. Well, once you do that, then all of a sudden you got kids who are interested, right? Because they begin to see that, oh, we're really all connected in this thing that we're doing, right? In this conversation, in this dialogue. At the all-boys school, they had this, like 3 weeks in, we had this show and tell for parents. And when they first said it to me, they were like, yeah, you know, parents are going to come in and you got to show them all about what you're going to do with their kids in the classroom. I was like, I got to do what? Well, you got to tell them all about the stuff that you're going to be doing. It's wonderful. It's how we kind of try to build the parental involvement. Okay, fine, right? And so I had to think about what is it that I wanted parents to know about my style of teaching. Again, we're talking about theology class, freshmen. And I said, okay, 3 things are going to happen in my classroom. Right? Now, my other colleagues were going through their whole curriculum for the year. That's what they were doing. Let me tell you, they're going to do this, this, and this. I said, 3 things are going to happen in my class. Your child is going to strengthen a relationship with God, or your child is going to establish a relationship with God, or your child is going to find out why they don't want to have a relationship with God. One of those 3 things are going to happen in my class. But they're going to have clarity around where they stand. And in gaining that clarity, we're going to go through the church teachings, we're going to do some scripture, we're going to go through the sacraments, we're going to watch some movies, we're going to do some projects. But they're going to do these 3 things. And that's it. Got any questions? So, now, the people are rolling through. You got like 30, 40 minutes, and I was done. I was like, you got any questions for me? It's a weird kind of thing to be a teacher and a public speaker and be an introvert, right? And so I am an extreme introvert. But I bet you don't know that. You didn't figure it out yet. But my presentations are quick like that because, it's like, let's get it over and let's get it over. Let's be done. So why do I think my story is important for what it is that you do? Right? So I made notes for myself. Just so that I don't talk a whole lot. Because when you're an introvert, once you start talking, you'll do nervous talking. So I think, first of all, my story matters because when you're talking about theology and this study of God, we're talking about this study of God, this chatting about God, this thinking about God, right? But if I'm a kid, even if I'm not a kid and I happen to be a parent, I want to know what you think about God. What do you have to say about who God is for you? Because here's the wonderful thing about Christianity that the bishop reminded us about. It's about relationship. As Christians, we do what? What do we do at the basis of who we are? We witness who God is in our lives. We witness. We're called to witness. Well, I'm not a very good witness if I haven't shared part of my story. I'm not a good witness if you don't even know any idea of how I come to know Christ. How do I get to be a witness? It's easy to just give the historical accounts. But why does someone want to follow? Because they've met someone else whose life has been changed. The whole piece that I put in my biography about, my life had been changed when I started working with other people was based on the fact that in my first marriage, I was helping my first husband raise his children. And everybody knows the Catholic school is the best education you can possibly get, whether you want to be there or not as a kid. But as an adult, it's the best education you can possibly get, right? You all are giving children the best education they could possibly get, right? You all don't seem excited about that. You all I want you all to be excited about the fact that you're doing the best that you could possibly be doing, right? At a Catholic institution, you're giving them the best education they could possibly get, right? Right. Okay, I feel a little better for your students now. And so I put the kids in this Catholic school that was close to the house, elementary school. And one of the requirements to go to this school was you have to go to church at least twice a month or something like that. And I was like, what? Well, you had to show up and go. And I was like, do I get a discount on tuition? And they were like, no. I was like, well, wait a minute. You making me show up. You know you want me to put something in the collection plate, and then you're not giving me a discount on tuition. Somewhere I'm not seeing the bargain in this. I don't see the point. But I did it for the boys, right? And on the first time I went to Mass, the pastor was at the door greeting everybody who came in. And by the time he got to me, he was like, welcome to the parish. What brings you here? And I was like, what do you mean, what brings me here? He was like, well, you're new to the parish. How do you know? Right? That was an encounter that I had never had at a Catholic church, that there was a pastor who knew the people of his parish enough to know when someone was a visitor. And if they knew if the person was a visitor, they never said it. And so that struck me as odd. Like, you know I'm new. Okay. Whatever. And on the way out, he was at the door again. Did you enjoy your worship with us? Hope to see you next week. And I was thinking, I don't have to come for 2 weeks. He said, so I'll see you next week, right? You should come at 10 for the gospel mass. I said, for the what? He said, the gospel mass. I said, there is such a thing as a gospel mass? Like, yeah, I'll be here. And then I walked away from that man going, the hell did I tell him I was coming back next week for? What was that all about? Now, it took me the whole week. I angst over the fact that I told this man I was coming. An entire week. I did this. And my husband was like, well, you don't have to go. I told the man I was coming. Well, he's not going to know. He is going to know. He already knew I was a visitor. He's going to know if I don't show up. So I showed up. The gospel mass was quite interesting and telling. It was a shock to my system. I had never been in a gospel mass before. And I was like, I didn't know that this happened in the Catholic Church. And they said, see you next week. And I was like, yes. By the 5th week, this man had me volunteering for the RCIA, of which I said, what is that? The rite of Christian initiation for adults. I said, what is that? Doesn't everybody come into church being baptized as babies? And then, he was like, no, you've been Catholic your whole life? I said, clearly I've missed some things. And so he had me volunteering for this course to help him with people, and I hated it. Right? I just thought it was the worst thing that could possibly ever happen, that you sit with people and you take turns reading out of a book and stop every so often and say, does anybody have any questions? Dude, for real? I started skipping class. I was a true student. I started skipping class. I made it to the Easter Vigil. I don't even know how. I made it to the Easter Vigil, which I thought was fantastic. I had never been to an Easter Vigil before. And I was like, well, what kind of Catholic am I that I've never been to an Easter Vigil? My mother never took us to an Easter Vigil. Right? Now, my mother was a convert to Catholicism, and so I believe in her whole understanding of Easter was Easter Sunday. And so that's what we celebrate, Easter Sunday. But the vigil, I didn't even know existed. And so I told the pastor at that time, I said, don't ever ask me to do anything like this again. This is terrible. I don't want to do it. And he was like, that's fine. No problem. And when it came time, right around time to start RCIA again, he was like, I need your help so that we could do this. But I said I didn't want to do it anymore. He said, yeah, I know, I heard you. And so I need your help to do this class. And I started doing it again. I don't even know what was going on with me, right? So at this point, just know that I wasn't missing mass either. And so I was like, this is weird. I don't know what's happening to me. So I did the second year. I didn't skip, but I was just like, something's got to change. And so I told him, I'm not doing this again. Please don't ask me. He's like, no problem. Year 3. I said, I'm not doing this. He was like, oh no, but you're so good at it. No, I'm not. I said, you know what I need? I need a class. I'm going to need a class. You want me to walk with people as they're entering the church. I'm going to need a class because I need somebody to walk with me. Right? And so he sent me to the diocese Master Catechist courses for African Americans, and it was called Catching the Spirit. 9 months to become a Master Catechist, right? Which was phenomenal. I was like, oh my God, this is great. Everything I was learning there, I was taking back, right, to the RCIA class, and guess what the pastor started doing? Skipping class. It became my class to do with whatever I wanted. At the end of that time, I said, I'm going to need another class. He said, you don't need another class. You're good. You took theology in college. I said, dude, theology in college for somebody who's just trying to graduate is just to get the A so that it boosts your GPA. So I wasn't trying to learn anything. I said, I need another class. He got me enrolled in an MDiv program. I didn't know why I was there, trying to figure that whole thing out, right? The MDiv program led to a doctorate of ministry. It's amazing how God works. And so this is what I believe. As much as God is working in my life and transforming my life isn't the only one that God is transforming. God is transforming your lives as well, right? Your life has gone through some changes as well, but who knows about it? How do people find out? How do they discover that you have a love for God and that's why you're teaching it? You got to share your story, right? The story of God involves all of us. And it helps your students see themselves in God. My whole issue with God as a young person was that God was not present in the situations that I was going through. And the sufferings that I was having, God was silent. Or so I thought. I thought God was not present. Right? Some 50 years later, I realized, oh, that's how I made it through this situation, is because of God. But there was nobody in my life who was helping me understand that God was present in my life and that I was present in God. That's what students need. And that's going to come through the story, right? Everything that the bishop started anchoring things in, he started anchoring in what? Stories. Other people's lives, their stories, bringing his points to life. Every time we're meeting up with colleagues, we start telling a story, right? When you leave this place and people say, well, how did that go? Andy, did you think it was okay? And what would you? Well, you're going to start with a story. And that story is going to be personal for you, how it impacted you. Not that you're trying to make some change in them, but you're talking about you and your witness. And so the connections that we make help things come alive for our students. My story, your story is that connection. When we can make that connection, all sorts of things become possible. We begin to see that we're not that much different from one another, right? There are so many things that are happening in our communities that their sole purpose is to separate us. Their sole purpose is to keep us at a distance from one another. And yet our God calls us to be, as the bishop said, in Eucharist with one another, right? Well, how does that happen? Does that happen just because I get to see you and now we're in Eucharist because I see you? No, that's going to happen because we are making connections. But how do we make the connections? Pieces of our story. It's pieces of our story that begin to make those connections. The kid asked me, well, he didn't ask, he made a statement. I will never be holy like you are. I said, oh, please. I am straight on the journey. I didn't start here. This is not my beginning. And he was like, it's not? I said, you think all of your teachers, this is their beginning? This is where they start? Well, some of them, like Mr. So-and-so is old, and I know that this is, I was like, no, this is not our beginning. And the question becomes, why do we present ourselves to our young people as though this is our beginning? How do they see their development and their transformation? Is it because we don't want them to know that we were 14 and 15 and how we were thinking? But the truth of the matter is we were. And we were probably thinking very much similar. But they don't get to see it. And why not? What are we hiding? What are we keeping to ourselves? Now, I've had a lot of people say to me, but I don't think they should know my business. It's my business, and people shouldn't have to know my business. I said, that's true. And there's a way to tell your story without telling your business, right? Your story can still live. I usually say it's the difference between gossiping about your life and just giving the highlights, right? There's a way to tell your story without getting all into the messiness of your life. All of the decisions that came into play, all of the players. You don't have to name all of the players. You don't have to name all of the mean people that were in your life. You don't have to name them. You just have to say that there was a group of people who didn't agree with you and they were mean. And you keep moving on to tell your story. Telling your business is getting into the messiness of it. Is naming names. Is, that person did this to me, is gossipy. And that's not what we're talking about. That's not what I'm talking about. Your story, though, is what anchors who you are, right? Talking about my mother sending us to Catholic schools my whole life, I could tell that story a whole different way. We can get into the business, right, of that story. Does that make it a better story? No, that doesn't make it a better story. That makes it a story like, oh, why is she telling us this part? What am I supposed to get from that? She went a little too deep. TMI, as people would say, right? TMI. So how do you do it? You had to buy the book for that one. I'm going to just leave it there. You had to buy the book for that one because it's a long, drawn-out process. Or you could take my class that I teach in the summer based on My Story, Your Story, right? The shameless plug that John Carroll University is doing. Hey, we're doing some great stuff over at the Institute of Pastoral Studies. No. And most of our stuff is online already. No, I won't do that. So I've given you a whole lot in about 40 minutes. So talk to me. What jumps out that excites you? What jumps out that makes no sense? What do you like? What don't you like? What do you want to hear more about? What are you struggling with that maybe you talking it out, we might be able to help in this room? What say you? Yes, sir.
I like how you tell your story. The young man said that you're very holy. You're basically trying to take something that's invisible and make it visible. You're making God visible in you. If they can see that in you, then they're going to have that same passion for God that you have.
Yeah.
That's what you're doing. You're making something invisible visible, which is a very hard subject to teach. Think about it.
Yeah.
It's not like math. You got the quadratic formula right there.
Yeah.
And what you're doing is you're making it authentic and real.
I hope so.
You are.
I hope so, because I believe God is real, right? But when we tend to talk about God, we're talking about mystery, invisibility, feelings.
But I got into the lesson you were teaching, and I can understand where you're coming from. And I want to do like you. That's how I was a student. I'm 14 years old. I want to be like my teacher.
I want to be like my teacher.
I want to have that same passion and love for God.
Yeah.
Maybe I don't have it right now, but I want it.
Mm-hmm. I ended up with no atheists.
Yeah, I believe it.
I ended up with no atheists. Let me just say that at the end of their freshman year, I ended up with no atheists. And after my second year of teaching in the all-boys school, my colleagues in the theology department, we had a theology meeting one day, and they said, would you stop teaching the way you do? And I would. And they said, you are setting the bar too high for us. I said, I'm going to need you to get on your game. That's what I'm going to need. You had a question and end this way.
Yeah, so I like what you're saying, and I do try to incorporate a lot of that personal element. I've found increasingly over the years, several years ago, students were much more able to be vulnerable. They were much more willing to sort of put themselves out there. At least my students, that's decreasing a little bit as time goes on. So suggestions you have to straddle that tension of, on the one hand, being uncomfortable is how we grow, we step outside of our comfort zone. But on the other hand, risking having them shut down even more, right? Not wanting to make themselves uncomfortable to the point that they, I don't want to say revert, but become more sort of closed off.
Yeah.
So how to straddle that tension of being uncomfortable, having it lead to growth and stepping out of a comfort zone, rather than the other way. Maybe, I don't want to say traumatizing somebody, but making them feel pressured or forced in a bad way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that question. It's a constant struggle, particularly thinking about who's present in the classroom, right? At the time that I was teaching, the black students in the classroom were the minority, right? And I was very cognizant of not making them feel like I did when I was in school as being the one to represent the race. But also not being the one who has to talk about everything black, right? As I was leaving the school, I found that I was in a position of helping gay students become vulnerable in an all-boys environment, right? So first things, I think I want to start slow with, can we be vulnerable around sports? Can we be vulnerable around television shows, right? All of the things that are external to them. And in what ways can they increasingly bring themselves to these external things before they are, just tell me the story about you. We can't get there yet. But how do you interact with the fact that the Padres won? I think the Padres won their division or something last week or whatever. They're playing again now, right? In the next phase, right? See, some of my baseball people in here are like, yeah. I was in San Diego last week, and so it was all about the Padres. And so you leave it you first put it in an arena that is outside of them. That I don't have to really make an investment one way or another. And so I get to creep my way into it. That was how I built my assignment, especially, with freshman theology, you have them the whole year, right? So you've got 9 months to be with them. It was the final assignment that was the most intimate, and they were doing a biography, right? But we built to that. And so I would say build, but start external, with external things. That they can give a comment or they can make their opinion about this thing. And you begin to validate their opinion. So that's going to be the other key, right? They're gonna have differing of opinions, but you validate them all. They're all important. And they begin to see how, though I think different than this student here, you still hold them all as valid and viable. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. So I have two questions. You kind of alluded to the first. Like, how does clinical counseling scaffold this pedagogy? Like, where's the science meeting the delivery? Because I know it works. It's exciting. But the second is kind of the dangers. Maybe Adam alluded to this. How do you avoid a cult of personality around the teacher, where it's more about me with you because you're you as opposed to me with God and I'm guiding you?
Oh, now let me answer the second one first. I bow out quickly because I'm always deferring to what God is doing, right? And what God has done. And so my life exists this way because of God, right? And so I am always then stepping to the side and say, now look at what God is doing in your life. Look at how God is showing up for you. And so I, as the persona, move. And it is a conscious effort, right, to move out of the way. Because I'm not trying to create people to be me. In all of my flaws, in all of my mess, I don't want another me. I don't need another me. That's not going to work. But I do need you to develop you into who you want to be. So I step out of the way and I make a conscious decision to do that and speak about it. to the students all the time. Now, the first question about clinical counseling and spiritual companioning, I don't do the clinical piece at all. But that's my husband. He does the clinical piece. He's the therapist. When he sees a point that someone is struggling in their spiritual walk, he calls me in. When I'm walking with someone, and I discover that what they're dealing with is way deeper than what I have, I call him in, right? And so some people we see together, some people we see separately. But I don't try to do his work at all, because we'd have a whole lot of messed up people where I'm talking about, let me help you with your depression, you know. Because he's constantly, I'm just like, I don't understand. I just don't understand why they just don't snap out of it, right? I'm that person, right? I'm like, well, you just make a decision. You just make a decision, and then you just keep getting up. And he was like, no, baby, it don't work like that. I was like, see, that's why you're the therapist. I don't believe either, too, that you can just pray it away. I do also believe that we're praying and we're doing. So it's a both and, yes. And then we'll come this way. No, it's you first, and then the young lady in blue.
So I just wanted to affirm one of the things that you were saying, and probably just because if anyone doubts how the teacher's role is to put themselves and their story out there, I mean, and you probably know, Archbishop Miller wrote, the Holy See's teaching on Catholic schools, 5 marks of a Catholic school, and one of those 5 marks is the personal sharing of the faith story of the Catholic educator to the students. It is a call of everybody, not just theology teachers, but all of them. And to put that piece out there, I think it really is it's vital for us to do, because if we're just talking catechetical knowledge and it isn't personalized, it doesn't get anywhere. And the piece that I wanted to see how it kind of feeds into you, there's a lot of research now on what the bishop brought up, a little bit of disaffiliation, students walking away, and how folks don't feel connected, and it's much more of a personal story. And some of the researchers are putting out that belonging precedes believing, and that connection to having a personal relationship is drawing people in. And so there's a lot more about catechesis as conversation. And I wanted to, if that's a phrasing that is familiar to you, your thoughts on it, it seems to tie a bit of what you've described.
Mm-hmm.
But thoughts on that catechesis as conversation.
When I think about why people are walking away, I don't want to just leave it with the young, in truth. I don't want to leave it with just young people are walking away. People my age are walking away too, right? Catechesis, I think, has had a bad rap in being distilled down to sacramental prep. I prepare you for the sacraments. Catechesis prepares you for the sacraments. It has not necessarily been lifted up in a way that says the church's catechetical endeavors are about you growing in faith. Growing in faith, right? It's as though growth stops at confirmation, and then the rest of your life you just kind of figure it out by going to Mass. The mass is going to do everything that needs to be done. Well, we hang a whole lot on the mass then, right? We put a lot on the mass as a Eucharistic celebration to handle everything that we as adults are going through. So if the mass is doing everything, where do I have my conversation about let me just make it personal. Where do I have the conversation about all of the anxiety that I'm feeling being my mother's guardian? My mother is 86 and she has dementia. Where do I have that discussion if all of my catechetical work is the Mass? How do I talk about all of the mess of being her guardian? Right? So the catechetical conversations have to live somewhere. But what has happened in our distillation, we have not made room for the conversations to take place. We have, in a way, removed the catechetical conversations where people can discuss the issues of life and where you would find God in it. Right? It's very difficult to just have an average conversation with someone about your caregiving of your mom who has dementia and find God in it. Who's having that conversation? Where are those conversations happening?
All of this was in context to youth, specifically.
Yeah.
But that's
But I just thought I would shift it to, it's also important on the other end. Because if we don't learn to have the conversations with our young people, we're not having the conversations with our elders, who are also walking away because now they feel what? Useless. There's nobody paying me any attention as an elder, right?
I was curious about two things. You had mentioned the extended introductions that you do with your students, and sort of like in a practical manner, like how do you have that happen in a classroom environment, like to begin that? We do something with our seniors second semester. Mm-hmm. It's a discipleship vocation, and I think that would be an interesting place with them to do that. But I'm just curious how that.
Curious how I do it. She's asking about the extended introductions. So there's a course I'm teaching now called Pastoral Care. CARE stands for Compassionate Accompanying Regardless of Ethnicity. And I ask students for that class to introduce yourself, the program that you're in, what year you're in, what organization you are a part of, because some are either in a parish, a diocese, or they're in school full time. And then give me an example of where accompanying someone proved to be a challenge because of their ethnicity. And that is the way in which they would be introducing themselves. So it's always rooted in a specific, right? With young people, I would probably say something like, introduce yourselves, tell me why are you at a school like this one, and introduce yourself through a character of, Game of Thrones. Because more than likely, most of them have seen Game of Thrones. So you kind of use whatever it is that the majority of the young people are familiar with, and then be like and introduce yourself through like your favorite character and why that would be your favorite character. Right? Because it gives a safe space, because now we're talking about Game of Thrones, but it also gives you insight because you've got to know Game of Thrones, and then you got to know the characters. And if you don't know Game of Thrones, then you got to go and find out about Game of Thrones. But you want to use something that you're familiar with, but you know that they're also familiar with, and then you get this, this is nice. So you're going to be, so you're that person. Okay. Wow. And you make little notes. I make notes. I'm always making notes. And then I always come back to that. So maybe 2 classes later, I would be like, so you were so-and-so in the Game of Thrones. How is that looking now? Are you still that character? Has anything changed? Why did it change? Right? To kind of keep them engaged with the external piece, where it's back to this gentleman's question about how do you get them to continuously open up versus closing themselves down. And so you have this external piece. Your second question.
One of the topics that we do teach is world religions. And it's always a struggle for me because I feel like the part of it is to help them dialogue with other religions from a Catholic perspective. So how to tell the story, if you will, or tell our story in the midst of teaching other religions, right? I'm just curious if that's ever come up or how that could be intertwined in there, because for them the constant comment is, well, I don't have to learn this. It's not relevant to me. And coming back to this place of being able to be.
Being able to dialogue with other people. I try to help people understand that the dialogue with other faith traditions, other people, helps you become you better, right? So the study of Buddhism is not for you to become Buddhist, but it's for you to help understand why you are Catholic. And that when you're in dialogue with people who are Buddhist, you have a better understanding of where they're coming from. When you start delving more into the stories, you can better do world religions, right? And so I guess a suggestion I would have is, whose stories can you get that can tell it from that perspective? Fascinating for me is to have a rabbi in my classes, where this rabbi is sitting in class. I teach from a Catholic perspective. I teach as a Catholic. I teach as a Black Catholic woman. But he's a rabbi. Okay, Rabbi, what you bring to the table? Right? It's about helping. I think my specificity helps you in your specificity. And it helps give you the words to explain who you are, why you are. And so for your students, it's you trying to get to know people. You're trying to open up your heart. And this is why we study world religions. It's so that you can become more open. I believe this is going to be my last one because you see Ed stood up.
But I think as teachers, we fall into that trap of being traditionalists, and we look at children as blank slates. You are a constructivist. That's what makes you so effective, where you let children construct the knowledge, and you build from their knowledge. And you also use the authentic pedagogy, where you use your newspaper to connect to their world beyond the classroom. That's what makes you effective. And if we could be more constructive like you, we'll be more effective teachers. Instead of being a traditionalist, where you look at a child as a blank slate, I'm going to teach you math and you're going to learn this math. I'm going to teach you religion, you're going to learn religion. You construct and learn from that. That's what makes you effective. I really like this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
On that note, thank you.